Chapter 22 of The Romance of the Animal World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by BettyB. The Romance of the Animal World by Edmund Selous. The little pilotfish is not the only friend that the shark has. The remora, or sucking fish, as we shall soon see, is still more attached to him. This is one of the queerest fish in the whole ocean. Others may have a more extraordinary, or at any rate a more terrifying appearance, but not one of them is constructed on such an original principle, or has such a very quaint and ingenious process of getting through the world. What the process is may be guessed from the name of sucking fish, but the remora does not suck with its mouth, but with its head. The whole upper surface of this consists of a large, flat, plate-like adhesive disc, and whatever this disc touches it adheres to with the greatest tenacity. The reason is that the air between the plate and anything it lies against is forced out, so that a vacuum is created, and when once this is the case, two things that touch each other always stick together. It is by virtue of this principle that a fly is able to walk along the ceiling, for all its 6 feet end in so many little adhesive discs or suckers, which act as strongly, in proportion to their size, as does that of the remora. But the remora, when it uses its sucker, does not walk, or even swim, which is the equivalent of walking in a fish. All that is done for it by the shark or turtle to which it attaches itself. It just swims underneath it and presses itself against its underside, and there it is carried along as safely as if it were riding in its own carriage. Indeed, much more so, for there is less likely to be an accident, and if ever there is, the remora can drop off without being hurt, as people generally are when they jump out of a carriage. It is difficult to imagine a more secure and delightful way of going about, and of all sea fish the remora, as it seems to me, must have the easiest and safest time. To all but him the fierce and greedy monsters of the deep, the swordfish and sawfish, the threshers, the sharks, and the killers, are a terror and a menace. But what can any of them do against a little sucking thing that sticks tight against them, in a place they cannot possibly get at? The remora, if it liked, could fix itself to the very sword or saw itself of these two redoubtable warriors. It would not probably, because when either were in action it would have to come off, but just behind one or the other, on the hilt or the handle, it could manage quite comfortably. It would then be just in front of their owner's mouth, but yet quite unreachable, so that, supposing it to be a dainty, this would make a very good illustration of Tantalus. With a sawfish, at any rate, such a situation would be quite possible, since there is a considerable space between the mouth and the beginning of the saw, and if there would not be room enough for it there, with the swordfish, the under part of the lower lip, or jaw, would do just as well. It is as the friend, or attaché, of the shark, however, that the remora is best known, and it is just in this position, or approaching to it, that he is said to fix himself, on the front or head part of the shark's body rather than behind, or on the tail. Now, of course, when the shark is eating anything, when he is tearing at a dead whale, for instance, fragments of the feast will float about in the water, and the nearer the remora is to the mouth of the shark, the nearer those are likely to come to it. This is the reason generally given for his choosing the position on the shark, which he is said to do, or for his swimming at the shark's mouth, when he chooses to swim with, rather than cling to him. However, as the remora is free to leave the shark whenever he chooses, and as the latter swallows his food whole, I cannot quite see what advantage he gains by being always in the advanced position. It is not as if he could not leave the shark, for then it might be a matter of life and death to him to be there, but as he must always know when the shark gets anything, and cannot well nibble the piece that goes down his patron's throat, as far as I can see he might as well sit lower down, as at the head of the table. For myself, therefore, I doubt the reason given for his choosing the latter position, and I should doubt the fact of his doing so, if there were not some evidence for it. For the remora often attaches itself to the hull of a ship, and it is natural to suppose that in such cases it mistakes the ship for a large shark or a whale. Now when it does so, it either sticks to or swims near the fore part of the vessel, but not behind or astern. Thus Professor Moseley describes it as swimming for weeks near the water surface just a foot in front of the cutwater. And he remarks on this that if it swam just behind the stern, it would get plenty of food, whereas in front of the bow it gets nothing whatever. Nevertheless, continues the professor, it stays on at what in a shark is of course the right place, ready to be at the beast's mouth directly food is found. This therefore seems to establish the fact. As to the reason of it, it has just occurred to me that when a shark bites a piece out of the living body of any creature, there must be a great rush of blood, and the remora would get the best benefit of this if it was just by the shark's mouth at the time. Or again, the little fish may feel more secure there than elsewhere. A shark is a large thing, 20, 30, or 40 feet long sometimes, and many voracious fish that might prefer to keep away from its head might be bold enough perhaps to approach its tail or the after part of its body. The remora apparently is not in the habit of going inside the shark's mouth, as does the pilot fish, so it may think the next safest thing to that is to keep as neat as it can on the outside. The wonderful power of adhesion possessed by the remora has been put to practical use by the Chinese, who actually employ it to catch turtles. A thin but very strong line is attached to a little iron ring, which is fitted round the base of the remora's tail, which as it becomes very narrow just there, and then swells broadly out to form the caudal fin, seems as if it were made for the purpose. Thus armed, the fishermen row or sail about till they see a turtle lying asleep on the water, and having come as close up to it as they dare, they drop several of these queer fishing lines over the side of the boat, or sampan as it is called. Should the remoras attach themselves to the sides or keel, they are dislodged with long bamboos, to which the lines serve as a guide, and then, swimming round about, before long they generally discover the turtle, to which they at once become fastened. If there were only one of them, it might not be possible to draw in so large and heavy a creature as a turtle, at least a large one, but with several it is not difficult to do so. The remoras are then detached and can be used in this manner again and again, as well as to catch a fish or two, should it be so desired. Afterwards, when they have done their day's work, they can be eaten themselves, for that is the way of the world, not of the Chinese only, as some people seem to think. The Chinese, it may be remembered, fish also with cormorants, round whose throats they weld a ring, to prevent their swallowing the fish. Two more novel and ingenious methods of following the gentle craft were surely never devised, but the more ingenious of the two, perhaps, that which I have just described, seems to have been practiced by the Indians of America, when the Spaniards, in an evil hour, first landed on that continent. Columbus himself, or if not he, one of his companions, has described the method, and how, when the remora is thrown overboard, it shoots like an arrow out of a bow towards the other fish, and then, gathering the bag on his head like a purse net, holds it so fast that he lets not loose till hauled up out of the water. The Indians, however, seem to have used but one remora at a time, as apparently they do now, and if it fixes itself to a turtle, instead of hauling it in, they dive down, following the line, and swim with it to the boat. We do not read that the old Greeks or Romans ever used the remora of the Mediterranean, for there are several species to fish with in this way. If they had, they would probably have expected it to pull in anything, even a whale, for their idea was that this little fish, by affixing itself to a ship, could retard its progress through the water, or even stop it if it wished to. Thus it was believed that at the Battle of Actium a remora held back Antony's ship, and thus contributed to his defeat. It seems strange that no one should have thought of turning such powers to practical account, not for fishing purposes merely, but also in naval warfare. Even now, were the story true, much might be done in this way. Instead of torpedoes discharged at the enemy's ships, we might read then of remoras having been successfully affixed to them. There are several different kinds of sucking fishes, and some of them, like the common lumpsucker which frequents our coasts, have the adhesive disc or part situated on the under surface. Of the true remoras there are also several species, the smallest being about 8 inches long, whilst the largest attains to 3 feet or more. If the remoras, by virtue of their parasitic relations with powerful and dangerous species, are the most protected of all fishes, we may perhaps look upon the flying fish of the southern seas as the most persecuted. At any rate, it is popularly supposed to be, and equally when it leaps out of the water, or after a long skimming flight descends into it again, the bonito, a sort of large mackerel, its principal enemy, is understood to be hungering for it. For myself, upon general principles, I am inclined to doubt this. Animals, it is well known, enjoy doing what they do with ease and mastery. If they have an art, they like to practice it. They do not seek to hide their light under a bushel. Why then should not a fish that can fly sometimes for its own amusement? That it should do so would be in accordance with all analogy. So, as it is no more than an assumption to hold that it does not, I shall hold that it does. One reads often about the gaping jaws of a dolphin or albacore appearing above the water just as the flying fish is about to descend into it, and no doubt this may frequently occur. But were the dolphin or albacore or bonito always expecting it, having pursued it underneath in the water, as we are told, I believe the signs of this would be much more frequent. It would be the usual thing then, I believe, to see the jaws or the whole body of the enemy leap into the air, or at least for there to be some disturbance in the water as the excursionist touched it. But this as a rule one does not see, at least I have not myself. Again, one reads so much about sea birds hovering in the air and ready to pounce upon the poor fish as soon as they issue from the waves. However, though I have made 3 sea voyages, one in a sailing ship, I have never had the luck to see this, from which I gather that there is at least a good deal of respite from this evil, to which, moreover, other fishes are subject. For whether in air or water, what matters it? No doubt, however, but that the Exocetus volitans, to give it its Latin name, is ardently pursued, and eaten, as it deserves to be, with the greatest relish. That its fins have been developed into wings, for the express purpose of escaping from such pursuit, is equally probable, and therefore it be very strange if they did not often enable it to do so. A good evidence of their efficacy is, I think, the enormous abundance of the species possessing them, so that perhaps, on the whole, these creatures of 2 elements, on whom such pity has been bestowed, have a better instead of a worse time than the majority of their fellows. The most curious thing I know about the flying fish is that the naturalists will keep on pretending that it can't fly. However, we must not be led astray by this, but go by the name and what our gallant seamen tell us. Also, we should remember this, that a sailor, when he sees a fish flying, or anything curious, is a free man, whereas a naturalist, under similar circumstances, has his hands more or less tied by a sort of professional etiquette, which requires that he should not let an animal be more interesting than he can help, or give in to any picturesque fact, unless it can be stated in a dull kind of way. The facility with which, in able hands, this compromise may be effected has led to many tardy admissions. But exceptional cases arise, and this perhaps may be one of them. For here is the tropic sea, blue as a sapphire, gleaming like a diamond, glancing and throbbing with such jewels of light that it looks as though thousands of silver fishes were jumping in the meshes of a golden net, flung down by the sun from the sky. All at once, from amidst these myriads of sparkles, a number flash higher, leap into the air, and fly, like bright arrows, towards you. Onwards they come, and from being light only, they pass into form and substance, begin to live, to move with sense and volition, and all at once they are fishes, flying with wings over their home of the sea. They sink towards the water, rise again, sink, rise, then dip for one moment, and the next go glittering up into the air and come spinning round in a curve. Thus they gleam on for a most astonishing distance, till, near you, they disappear into the sea, or, far away, become again the sparkling jewels of the sun. And all around, over the great wide sea, these showers of living gems are leaping in and out of it. It is a most beautiful sight. The body of the fish is of a light gleaming blue, and the delicate film-like wings, springing from just behind the gills, and extending backwards almost to the tail, set it, as they rapidly quiver, in a soft and silvery haze. It is of course the pectoral fins that thus perform the office of wings, and by moving them and steering a course their owner flies as truly for the time as does either a bird or a bat. Those who deny this, the naturalists aforesaid, say that the flying fish never go for a greater distance without touching the water than the initial impetus of their leap out of it carries them to. Now the swim bladder of the flying fish is so large that when the creature distends it, as it has the power to do, it occupies almost the whole cavity of the body, which thus becomes full of air, and, besides this, it has another sort of bladder in its mouth, which it can inflate through the gills. Thus it is all air, and everybody knows how difficult it is to throw a light, bladdery thing to any distance. A stone goes much farther. What sort of impetus must that be which can, in this instance, throw it to 500 or 1,000 yards? And is it not more likely that a small fish (it is only about a foot long), whose fins have become developed so as to support it in the air, and whose body has been turned into an air sac, should have been enabled to fly, rather than leap, these wonderful distances? When I first saw flying fish myself, I felt quite angry at the nonsense I had been made to believe about them through the natural history books, and from that moment I resolved that I would be as cautious in trusting to what are called sober statements as to statements that may seem to be exaggerated. Certainly it is the sailors here, and not the scientists, who best know what they are talking about. And so, as they have seen a great deal more of flying fish than I have, instead of repeating my own opinion, I will end the subject and this chapter with that of one who, to all the advantages of a sailor, adds those of being a careful observer and a very picturesque writer. At any rate, I don't see how he can have been mistaken in such matters as these, and if not, there ought to be an end, at last, of that long enduring fallacy that the flying fish cannot fly. Mr. Bullen then, and I quote him as an authority, says at page 188 of his Idylls of the Sea: "As the result of personal observation extending over a good many years, I assert that the XXIII does fly. I have often seen a flying fish rise 200 yards off, describe a semicircle, and, meeting the ship, rise 20 feet in the air perpendicularly, at the same time darting off at right angles to its previous course. Then, after another long flight, when just about to enter the water, the gaping jaws of a dolphin gave it pause and it rose again, returning almost directly upon its former course. This procedure is so common that it is a marvel it has not been more widely noticed. A flying fish of mature size can fly 1,000 yards. It does not flap its fins as a bird, but they vibrate like the wings of an insect, with a distinct hum. The only thing which terminates its flight involuntarily is the drying of its fin membranes and their consequent stiffening." End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Romance of the Animal World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by BettyB. The Romance of the Animal World by Edmund Selous. Chapter 23. It used to be thought that the great whales, the cachalot, the torquil, and the Greenland whale, were the largest of ocean's dwellers. But if evidence is of any value whatever, there is one marine creature that is larger even than they; indeed, so much larger and more powerful that he is able to make them his prey, conquering them, even the mighty sperm whale himself, by main strength put forth in single combat. This portentous monster is of course the great sea serpent, which has been seen, at intervals, probably from time immemorial, and recorded also from at least as far back as 1734. In 1740 we have Bishop Pontoppidan's word for its appearance, and we know now that he was right about the kraken, who describes it as having a length of 600 feet, and in 1822 it was again seen off Norway, and again it was 600 feet long, so perhaps it was the same one. Then, in 1829, there is a description of such a creature seen in the Indian seas, which tallies on the whole with the later joint account of Captain Bequie and Lieutenant Drummond of HMS Daedalus in 1848. Captain Bequie describes the creature that he saw as an enormous serpent with head and shoulders kept about 4 feet constantly above the surface of the sea, and as nearly, he says, as we could approximate by comparing it with the length of what our main topsail yard would show in the water, there was at the very least 60 feet of the animal a fleur d'eau, no portion of which was, to our perception, used in propelling it through the water, either by vertical or horizontal undulations. There seemed to be as much as 30 or 40 feet of tail as well. This great serpent, which, however, by this computation would not have been so large as the largest whales, passed the ship rapidly, but so close under our lee quarter that had it been a man of my acquaintance I should easily have recognized his features with the naked eye. It had no fins, but there was something like the mane of a horse, or rather a bunch of seaweed washing about its back. It swam at about the rate of 15 miles an hour, and was in sight for a full 20 minutes. Lieutenant Drummond thought the creature looked more like an eel than a snake. It had, he thought, a back fin 10 feet long, and also a tail fin. The head, too, he describes, I think, as of a somewhat different shape, and says that it was rather raised and occasionally dipping. Still, there is nothing in the one account that is irreconcilable with the other, nor is it often the case that two people, seeing the same thing, describe it in just the same way. The Daedalus at the time that this creature was seen was somewhere between the Cape of Good Hope and St. Helena. 27 years later, in 1875, the officers and crew of the bark Pauline, while sailing in the Indian seas, had a still more interesting experience. They were, one day, watching 3 large sperm whales not far from the ship, when a most enormous serpent, shooting suddenly out of the water by the side of the largest one, encircled it in 2 coils of its body, and in about 15 minutes, during which time there was a terrific struggle between the 2 leviathans, succeeded in crushing it to death. This at least may be assumed, for one by one the ribs of the unfortunate whale were heard to crack, with a sound resembling the report of a small cannon, and at the end of the time stated, the snake dived downwards, carrying its victim with head first. When one thinks of the enormous strength of a large bull cachalot, which may be from 50 to 80 feet in length, one can form some idea of that of the monster by whom it was overpowered. Yet possibly it was not so much the strength of the great serpent as the application of it, by which the whale was vanquished. Could it have got any portion of the sinuous body within its vast toothed jaws, or could it have delivered a blow upon it with its mighty tail, the issue of the combat might have been different, but enveloped in a double noose, each foot of which was charged with enormous constricting power, its strength was choked out of it, and as the serpent's tail, or that part of it beyond the folds on one side, no doubt hung down in the water, whilst as much of the neck as was disengaged on the other would have been equally out of harm's way, what could the whale, who was all the time suffocating, do? Neither with jaws nor tail would any effective reply have been open to him. He might also as easily have struck or bitten himself as the preposterous enemy that was wreathed so closely about him. When one comes to think of it, it is most extraordinary what powers are contained in the limbless body of a snake. The ancestors of snakes had limbs, as can be proved by dissection, for in some, even now, the minute bones of rudimentary hind legs lie embedded in the flesh. They are, of course, perfectly useless, and their presence can only be explained on evolutionary doctrines. Snakes, then, have lost their limbs, and the theory is that they have lost them because they gradually came to require them less and less, not because their body got to be better adapted for the uses to which limbs are put. And yet, to a very large extent, this has actually come to be the case. For instance, one thing that the two forelegs or arms seem specially fitted for is to clasp or hug, as we see not only with ourselves, but to an even greater extent with the ant eater of South America, or, according to popular belief, at any rate with the bears. A snake, however, with its long rope-like body, can hug with infinitely greater power and effect than can the strongest pair of arms belonging to an animal of the same size, or rather weight. But not only arms, but even hands may be eclipsed, for the whipster of America, by coiling two different parts of its body round the body of another snake, and then suddenly straightening out the portion between them which has hitherto been looped, can tear the individual so attacked into halves. It is doubtful, however, whether a monkey of comparable size could do the same with hands and arms together. In both monkeys and men, again, one of the most useful offices of the hand, perhaps we may call it the chief office, is to convey food to the mouth. But this a snake can do with a coil of its own body, if not as well as ourselves, at least a good deal better than can many animals whose hands are only paws. Again, most animals can raise themselves on their hind legs so as to survey the surrounding country, and they walk with their heads raised more or less in the air. These privileges snakes are supposed to have forfeited, yet some of them can stand several feet high if they wish it, and they can even get over the ground, and that at considerable speed, with the head and front part of the body held thus high in the air. When a creature loses certain highly developed organs which it once possessed, it is said to have degenerated, to have become a more lowly organized being, and the theory is that as its wants were lowly it has gained by the change, for a complicated structure is only an encumbrance when it is not required. What good, for instance, would arms and legs be to a man if he only cared for crawling through mud? He had much better lose them and become like a worm. But if snakes have lost their limbs in accordance with these principles, on what principle is it that they can do as much or more without them as other animals can with? For my part, I can't help thinking that their wants, instead of diminishing, increased, and that, as their limbs didn't improve, they used their bodies and found they did better with them. The different people who had seen the sea serpent on board the Pauline went before a magistrate, and made a statement to that effect, which was taken down in writing. I have read it, and it agrees with all I have said, except that there is nothing in it about the cracking of the whale's ribs. As, however, this is mentioned as having occurred both in Chambers' Encyclopedia and elsewhere, I suppose it really did. That is to say that the men who witnessed the combat heard the loud noise like a cannon shot as each rib broke, and talked about it afterwards, though they did not mention it before the magistrate. The sea serpent, as well as other huge monsters of a less snake-like appearance, continued to be seen at tolerably frequent intervals after this, and the last time, I think, was only a year or two ago. Again it was a serpent, and off the coast of Norway, and it came so near that that ship, which was not a large one, seemed endangered, and someone who was on it fired a shot, on which the monster sank. From all this evidence it would appear that there are various unknown creatures of vast size inhabiting the sea, which are but rarely seen, and that one of these is a gigantic serpent that crushes its prey to death, like a boa constrictor on land. When one thinks how vast the expanse of ocean is, how profound are its depths, and how inaccessible, compared to the land, is the floor over which its waves roll, this does not seem very wonderful, especially as, even on the land, new animals, sometimes of considerable size, are from time to time discovered. The real wonder is that the sea serpent should have been disbelieved in for such a very long time. Now a great many people do believe in it, even including some of the more learned ones, who tell us so in solemn, pompous strains, as if what they thought about a thing was almost as important as the thing itself, or indeed quite, if not more so. There are scientists, in fact, who seem really to fancy that by giving their adherence to anything they allow it to be, and so, as it were, create it. Nothing else surely can explain the sense of awful responsibility under which they seem to labor. No wonder, then, that they should hesitate before saying, "Let there be sea serpents." Any conscientious man would take their size and voracity into consideration. Next to the great sea serpent, the largest and most powerful constricting snake that we know of is the anaconda of South America, which grows to be at least 30 feet long, and is said by the Spaniards to be capable of overpowering and eating a bull. Hence the Spanish name for it is matador, or bull killer, but whether the name is founded upon a fact or a fiction does not appear to be certain. Waterton thought that the Spaniards must have known what they were talking about, and that the very name was an evidence of the thing. He was told, moreover, that the matador grew to a much greater length than 30 feet, more than double as long in fact, but of this again there is no satisfactory evidence. It does not seem in itself impossible that a snake of even 30 or 35 feet in length should be able to destroy a bull. But there is one thing which inclines me to doubt the anaconda's doing so, as well as its growing to such a size as the Spaniards reported. Before South America was colonized by the Spaniards, there were no cattle in the country, so we must assume that this great snake was not larger or stronger than would be necessary to allow it to overcome the largest wild animals with which it came in contact. These would be the jaguar and the tapir, and as neither of them are so large, or I think so strong, as the Spanish South American bull, the latter ought, one would think, to be too much for an anaconda. This is not quite conclusive, indeed, for the jaguar itself found no difficulty in preying on horses and cattle as soon as they were introduced, though it had had nothing larger to attack before than the tapir or guanaco. Nay, more, the puma, which is smaller and more slightly built than the jaguar, at once began to attack these larger animals, as though it had been both native and to the manner born. Still, in the manner in which these creatures secure their prey, agility and skill, since they generally dislocate the neck, may come more into play than sheer strength, whereas it is the latter that would be most required by a serpent in the actual process of constriction after the seizure had once been made. Be this as it may, the safest plan is to limit our ideas in regard to the destructive powers of the anaconda by what it has been known to do, and I do not think that there is any properly authenticated instance of its having killed a bull. Not for us, that is to say; there may be cases known to the Spaniard. Now, the anaconda is very fond of the water. Indeed, it is almost, if not quite, as amphibious as the crocodile, and I have sometimes wondered if it does not prey upon the latter. If it does, then we probably see in this the starting point from which the great oceanic anaconda, or sea serpent, has been developed. We have only to picture the remote ancestors of the latter having got first to the mouths of the rivers, and then further and further out to sea, proceeding from crocodiles to sharks of about the same size, and so to larger sharks, and thence, gradually, to more and more gigantic marine forms, till at length, in fierce contention with rorqual or cachalot, the zenith of power was attained. Other snakes which live in the sea are small, or comparatively small, and these, which, unlike the sea serpent, are very well known, are extremely poisonous. They no doubt have had their origin in some water-loving viper or other kind of poisonous snakes, of which there are many examples. Most snakes, indeed, are fairly at home in the water, and all probably are perfectly well able to swim. Of venomous land snakes, the most deadly perhaps is the well-known cobra, or hooded snake of India. The skin of the neck in this species is flattened out from just behind the head. Under ordinary circumstances it lies loose, and is not so very noticeable, but when angry or excited the cobra can inflate it, and it then becomes very conspicuous. To do so, it rears its head, together with the upper part of its body, into the air, standing as it were on its tail, and hissing loudly, presents a both strange and terrifying experience. This is the snake that the Indian snake charmers lure out of its hole by playing on a sort of pipe, and then catch and handle with impunity. I at least believe that they can do so, and also that they are able, should they chance to be bitten, to cure the bite by applying to it a curious substance which is called a snake stone. I believe it because one of these snake stones has found its way into Africa, probably through the Portuguese, and there I have seen it in the possession of a Dutch family of the name of De Lange, who, though poor people, once refused £50 for it. This proves their belief in its efficacy, and that belief has been founded upon a number of trials, every one of which was successful. Here is one of them. I quote it from my brother's work, Travel and Adventure in Southeast Africa, pages 14 to 15. De Lange told us that the value of the stone was well known in the district, as it had saved the lives of so many people, whom he named, and several horses. Amongst other names he mentioned that of a daughter of an old elephant hunter named Antony Fortman, who, he averred, had been bitten by a cobra some years before, when quite a child. As the stone had to be sent for, it had only reached her, he said, just in time to save her life. 2 years later, in 1877, this story, at any rate, met with a curious confirmation. At that time, Antony Fortman was at Tati, in Matabeleland, where his family, his eldest daughter being a girl about 16 years of age. I had quite forgotten about the snake stone, when one day the conversation turned on snakes. Antony Fortman said to his daughter, "Turn up your sleeve and show Mr. Selous where the snake bit you." This she did, and on the girl's left arm, near the shoulder, was a very large and ugly scar, as if a piece of flesh had sloughed away, and the wound had then skinned over. Fortman then proceeded to tell me how the girl had been bitten some years before in Marico, when quite a child, and that a horse had been saddled up at once, and a messenger dispatched for De Lange's snake stone; how the little girl had become insensible and turned nearly black before the stone arrived, and that it had been twice applied before it drew out the snake poison. Both De Lange and Fortman described the action of the stone in the same way. Friedrich de Lange told me that he had brought this snake stone with him from the Cape Colony, and that it had been an heirloom in his family for some generations. Evidence like this appears to me stronger even than the sneers of doctors, though that too should be strong, considering how constantly they have sneered at the truth in whatever new form it presented itself. Inoculation, mesmerism, and so forth, anything in fact that they did not understand, so that they were never at a loss for material. Almost, if not quite as poisonous as the Indian cobra, is the rattlesnake of America, and again the puff adder of Africa. However, I am not writing a book about snakes, so as space obliges me to finish this chapter, I will only add that I once walked right over a puff adder without stepping on it, and consequently without its biting me. If it had done so it would have saved me a great deal of worry and trouble, as is usual in such cases, for I was alone on the top of a very steep hill, and the homestead lay a long way off at the bottom. The brandy bottle, therefore, which is the colonial remedy for being bitten, as well as for not being bitten, by a puff adder, would not have been forthcoming, and I had no snake stone in my pocket. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of the Romance of the Animal World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Prajakta. The Romance of the Animal World by Edmund Selous. Chapter 24. Hunting ruses amongst the higher animals, wolves, foxes, and jackals, untempered justice, gesture language in men and dogs, the Cape hunting dog and his prey. In several of the preceding chapters, we have seen something of the stratagems and contrivances made use of by various creatures, fish, insects, birds, or crustaceans, in order to secure their prey. Similar devices, as might be expected, are not unknown amongst the mammalia also. The list, however, is not so long as one might expect, considering the superior intelligence of this class of animals, but we must remember that it is not so easy to study the habits of wild quadrupeds as it is those of insects and various small creatures. It is principally with wolves, foxes, and jackals that the observations in question have been made, no doubt because such animals, owing to their abundance or through other reasons, have come more into contact with mankind. All these three species, either habitually or occasionally, hunt together in concert, that is to say, either two or more carry out a certain plan, in which each helps the other. Thus, in India, Mr. Elliot observed one morning two wolves standing side by side as though in consultation, whilst far off upon the plain grazed a small herd of nilgais, the typical Indian antelope, on which their eyes were, from time to time, fixed with a greedy longing. At length, the plan of campaign was decided upon. One of the wolves trotted quietly off to a small nullah or ravine, where it lay down amidst the bushes with which its sides were dotted, whilst the other, with a stealthier pace, made a wide circle which brought him, at length, unobserved, on the farther side of the antelopes and at no great distance from them. Further concealment was now unnecessary, and suddenly flinging off the mask, the wolf rushed down upon the startled creatures and began to drive them towards the nullah. This it did by continually rushing round either on one side or the other, according as the herd showed a disposition to break away to right or left of the line along which they were required to go, exactly as a sheepdog drives the sheep to the fold. At length, when the nullah was reached, the wolf that lay behind a bush on the very edge of it leapt suddenly out and selecting a doe sprang upon it, and being joined by its fellow strategists, the two soon pulled it down and feasted on it at their leisure. What would have happened had the wolf behind the bush failed in securing an antelope, and had the herd in consequence got away? We may surmise from the following anecdote, as told by Jess in his well known Gleanings from Natural History. A sportsman, I think it was in Scotland, had walked out one evening with his attendant, hoping to shoot a hare. They proceeded together to some rocky ground, part of which formed the side of a very high hill, which was not accessible for a sportsman, and from which both hares and foxes took their way in the evening to the plain below. There were two channels or gullies made by the rains, leading from these rocks to the lower ground. Near one of these channels, the two men stationed themselves. They had not been there long when they observed a fox coming down the gully and followed by another. After playing together for a little time, one of the foxes concealed himself under a large stone or rock which was at the bottom of the channel, and the other returned to the rocks. He soon, however, came back chasing a hare before him. As the hare was passing the stone where the first fox had concealed himself, he tried to seize her by a sudden spring, but missed his aim. The chasing fox then came up, and finding that his expected prey had escaped through the want of skill in his associate, he fell upon him, and they both fought with so much animosity that the parties who had been watching their proceedings came up and destroyed them both, thus making incomplete a most interesting observation. In all probability, therefore, the two wolves, had the one that lay in ambush missed his spring, would have fought too, and this makes me the more inclined to believe a story which was told me, not however by an eyewitness, of wolves in America. from which it would appear that when the stratagem is carried out by more than a pair of associates, the duty of seizing the prey, if it devolves upon a single member of the band, may be a very dangerous one indeed. In the case alluded to, the wolf that had to do this lay down by a small stream at a place where it was fordable, and a wapiti was driven down upon it through woods that fringed the bank by the rest of the pack, amounting to a dozen or more. Knowing the ford, the wapiti made straight for it, and the wolf, springing up at the critical moment, either missed his mark or was shaken off by the powerful quarry. He was foiled at any rate, and the wapiti, dashing into the water, gained the opposite bank and got clean away. Hardly had he disappeared when the pack, headed by a wolf of great size and strength, evidently the leader, came up. And now a most remarkable and withal tragic scene was enacted. The wolf that had failed flung itself on its back, and winning in the most pitiful way, appeared to bespeak of the mercy of its incensed fellows, and especially of the grim-looking leader, whose action in the matter all seemed to await expectantly. For a moment or two, during which the whines and cries of the wretched criminal rose to an agony, the latter seemed to waver, but ferocity or long established custom carried the day. He sprang forward to execute justice, and his example being instantly followed by the rest of the pack, the poor penitent was quickly torn to pieces and devoured on the spot. I cannot, as I say, vouch for this story, as I have not read or heard the original account of the person who is supposed to have witnessed the incident, but it tallies very curiously with the other two, both of which are authentic. Everybody is familiar with the way in which a dog, when it wishes to propitiate its master and to deprecate punishment when scolded, throws itself on its back with its tail turned up between its legs. Now, this is a habit which every dog has brought with it from its wild ancestry, and one may be often seen to employ it towards another when it is afraid to fight, knowing that it would be well beaten. It is the converse, as it were, of the bristled back and elevated tail with which dogs approach each other when they really mean to fight, and with neither of these two expressions, as one may call them, can man have had anything to do. We now see to what use the first of them is put by wild canine species, and if it was not on this occasion effective, we may be sure that on many others it both has been and will be. There is another very curious and interesting thing in connection with this habit amongst domesticated dogs. If man has not taught it to them, they possibly may have taught it to him. Somewhere in the Odyssey of Homer, I cannot give the place, but I have often read references to it. It is told how, when travelers come to a village and a lot of fierce dogs belonging to the inhabitants rush out upon them, they immediately squat down on the ground, and that then the dogs cease to molest them. Now, Dr. Schliemann, when he traveled in the Ionian Islands, found that this was the regular habit with the peasants on coming to strange villages, or when they visited shepherds living with their sheep in the open country. The same expedient is resorted to by the peasantry of Hungary and Macedonia and other countries of Europe, where the conditions of life are more or less primitive. Also, I believe in the East or parts of it, and most interesting of all, at showing the habit to be almost universal. The Kafirs of South Africa, under similar circumstances, act in the same way. The chief Lobengula, before he learnt too late the real ends and aims of the Aryan, had some large fierce dogs which used to rush out to attack any native that came to see him at his primitive palace. To offer any resistance to their onset would have been death to anyone, and the resource employed, just as in the other cases, was to crouch on the ground, in which lowly and defenseless position, though sometimes one of the men would get a bite, they were generally let alone. The dog, therefore, seems to understand this attitude in a man just as he does the still more prostrate one employed by himself, for in truth it is very similar. A man who meditates attack or intends to defend himself stands firm and erect, with chest expanded and head thrown back. When he sinks to the ground, with his head hung, his arms resting passively, and his chest drawn in, as follows naturally from the position, all this is reversed, and the one posture as strongly expresses submission or at least a peaceable intent as the other does war and defiance. I do not imagine, however, that man has really studied the dog's method and made use of it himself in order to disarm him, but rather that his own mode of expression is governed by the same principle, and that, having been accustomed to deprecate the wrath of a superior by crouching before him, he puts the same plan in practice to mitigate canine fury. The jackals of Ceylon, as no doubt of India and other countries, employ the same kind of stratagem for the securing of prey as do wolves and foxes. A pack of them will surround any covert having a limited area into which they have seen a hare or one of the smaller kinds of deer enter, and some always take care to station themselves about the path where the game entered and by which they know it will most likely come out again. Possibly their places may be assigned to the various members of the pack by the leader, for it is he, we are told, who gives the signal for the attack to commence, by first raising his voice in the loud and peculiar cry, which all who live in lands where jackals roam know so well. Okay, 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 he repeats in howl upon howl. Okay, 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 come the answering cries of the rest, and into the jungle they all dash, out of it shortly afterwards at the expected place. Dashes, if all goes well, the terrified animal to be pulled down on the outskirts. This is a good ruse, but a still more cunning one is sometimes employed by the jackals of India. That is to say, they have been seen to employ it, for no doubt other jackals might act in the same way under similar circumstances. In this instance, a considerable number ranged themselves at intervals along a patch of jungle skirting the shores of a lake and just within it so as to be concealed. Here they quietly waited till about midnight. By the light of the moon, a fine axis deer was seen to leave the jungle and advance over the narrow strip of foreshore which separated it from the water. Just before commencing to drink, it turned and snuffed towards the jungle, but either the wind must have been in the right direction or its thirst overcame its caution, for turning again and stooping to the cool stream that lay white and still in the moonlight, it took a draught so deep and so long that it seemed as though it would never be ended. At last, however, it was satisfied, and walking back, swollen now and distended through the inordinate amount that it had swallowed, it was about to re-enter the jungle, when a jackal, springing with a yelp from its outer fringe, barred its further advance. The startled deer wheeled suddenly round, ran for some distance along the open space, and then again tried to enter the jungle, only to be again driven back by the same sharp yelp and spring, striking terror to its heart. A fresh attempt was frustrated in the same way, and being followed by a longer run, the deer now passed out of sight, but for a long time yelp succeeded yelp at irregular intervals, growing fainter and fainter till they were lost in the distance. The result of the ruse was not, therefore, in this instance witnessed, but in all probability it justified the sagacity of the jackals. Forced to keep running whilst its stomach was swollen with the water it had drunk, the deer must soon have become exhausted and as little able to fight as to escape through speed, in which condition the pack would have closed upon it and pulled it down. But why were the jackals so anxious that the deer should not enter the jungle? Any obstacles which the thickness of the undergrowth might have offered to their own pursuit would, one would think, have been still more effective in checking the flight of their victim, in which case they ought to have been able to tire it out and then pull it down all the sooner. Possibly, however, the axis, being an animal many times larger and stronger than themselves, might be able to plunge through covert which they would be unable to penetrate. Or again, it might have turned to bay under more favorable circumstances. The witness of this very interesting scene was no other than the last man of the ill-fated Afghan expedition of 1841-2, who appears to have been an intelligent observer and trustworthy recorder of the ways and habits of animals. He was unable, as he thought, to estimate the number of jackals engaged in the hunt on account of the possibility of each one having turned back the deer many times by running past it and posting itself again. This does not appear to me likely, for if the jackals were able so easily to outrun the deer, they might have pulled it down then and there, if in large numbers, and if there were only a few of them, it does not seem likely that they could ever have overpowered so strong an animal. I think it much more probable that there was a jackal to each yelp, and that, seeing where the deer was about to turn in, it was able to shift its position in time to meet it, if not exactly posted before. Indeed, all these ruses seem based upon the superior speed of the animal against which they are employed, for if two or more wolves or jackals can run down a deer or an antelope, why should they not do so together, instead of one hiding and the other driving the prey? For this reason, though it is stated that the one wolf drove the herd of nilgais to the place where it wished them to go, as a shepherd dog drives a flock of sheep, I must suppose either that it could not have overtaken them, or that there is some flaw in the reasoning of the animal when it lays the trap. No doubt a short chase is better than a long one, but the idea which one receives when one reads of a wolf running on this or that side of an animal so as to drive it just where it wants it to go is that it could overtake it if it pleased. With the foxes, however, everything is plain and straightforward, since except by stratagem they could not possibly catch a hare. All animals, however, like to take their prey by surprise if they can, and of this I have myself seen an interesting instance in South Africa, where I lived for nearly 3 years. I was once riding along the wagon road, a sandy trail winding amidst thick thorn bush somewhere in Bechuanaland, when all at once there jumped out upon either side a pair of Cape hunting dogs in act to spring. They were bending indeed and all elastic on the very point of making the leap, when, taking in the situation both at the same time, they each stood a little up on their hind legs, and with a curious look of having made an awkward mistake, they turned and disappeared into the bush again. The whole in silence, they did not utter one sound. No doubt the dogs had heard the beat of the horses' hoofs along the road, and thinking it was wild game, had hidden one on each side, prepared to leap together as it passed and pull it down. From the total change of their whole demeanour and their expression, very like a dog's when it has made some foolish mistake, I feel quite sure that they had not expected a man to be mixed up in the affair, nor is any instance of their attacking one, even when in numbers, on record, So far as I know, it seems evident, therefore, that they could not have seen me before, as I came riding along, since one glimpse would have shown them that a man was on the horse. But now a puzzle arises. It is not usual for game to come trotting along the wagon road, nor does the Cape hunting dog ever attack the oxen or horses of white men in the interior. At least I have not heard of its doing so. Why then did these two take up their position on either side of the path as though to wait till something passed along it, a thing which would only happen at very long intervals and then would be more likely to be a mounted man or a wagon or oxen than anything else? Unless some antelopes are accustomed to use the wagon roads in South Africa, which I have never heard of their doing, judgment here on the part of the two dogs must have been at fault. For this reason, though nothing seemed clearer than that this had been their plan at the time, I do not now think that it was. I believe they were governed entirely by their sense of hearing, which was either so acute as to bring them both to just the right place and at just the right time for the joint attack, or else that they judged by the regularity of the hoof beats and the direction in which they were proceeding that the animal, whatever it was coming along the road. The last, I think, is the most likely, and this again would show one of the wild indigenous animals of South Africa has by this time learned the use and meaning of the wagon roads that cross the country. All the above stratagems are of a collective nature. Two or more animals, that is to say, take part in them, and these are more interesting than where merely one is concerned, since the capacity to combine of itself shows a high degree of intelligence. A simpler sort of ruse or wile may be displayed in the manner in which a beast of prey assaults and overpowers its victim, and this is especially the case where it hunts alone, and the quarry is much more powerful than itself. These two wild dogs were prepared, evidently, to attack a large animal jointly, but either of them probably would have been able to run down and kill one of equal size in the open. A sable antelope is a larger animal, I should say, than the Bassetto pony I was riding. It stands higher at any rate and has a very formidable pair of horns, which it can use most adroitly and with deadly effect. The Cape hunting dog knows this well, and when it overtakes its dangerous quarry, which it can do with ease, instead of holding on to it, in which case it would be immediately transfixed, it springs up and inflicts just one bite in the flank, letting go instantly and then pursuing it again. In its next spring, it gives another bite in just the same place, and in this way it at last succeeds in tearing open the poor beast's flank, from which the entrails then protrude and can be cruelly torn out and devoured. Of course, under these circumstances, the poor antelope soon dies and is eaten by the dog, a process, however, which in all probability is commenced by the latter some time before life is extinct. Such is nature, and as there is no appeal from her ways, it is no use quarreling with them. The best plan is to be an optimist, and then everything seems right in tries. As far as I know, there is only one published account of a sable antelope being pursued by a single Cape hunting dog in this way, nor was the incident in this case witness to its natural conclusion. It has not been absolutely proved, therefore, that such a chase may be brought by the dog to a successful conclusion, but I myself have no doubt whatever that it both can be and sometimes is, for I do not believe that wild animals ever attempt what it is not within their power to achieve, though of course they may sometimes fail in the attempt. They are guided by their experience, and though there are exceptions to every rule, it is safe to assume that in the important concerns of their life, We never see a grown wild animal either making a first experiment or doing a foolish thing. The account above alluded to is by my brother, and as it is very interesting, I will conclude this chapter with it. We this day witnessed a very pretty sight as we were riding across a wide open down between the Zweswe and Umfjul rivers. We had a short time previously noticed a solitary old sable antelope bull feeding on the edge of a small strip of bush that intersected the plain. Suddenly, this antelope, which was 600 or 700 yards distant, came running into the flat straight towards us, on perceiving which we reined in our horses and looked around for the cause of its alarm. This was soon apparent, for before long we saw that an animal was running on its tracks, and though still distant, overhauling it fast, for the sable antelope, not being pressed, was not yet doing its best, so that when it was about 200 yards from us, its pursuer, which we now saw was a wild dog, was not more than 50 yards behind it. The noble looking antelope must just then have seen us, for it halted, looked towards us, and then, turning its head, glanced at its insignificant pursuer. That glance, however, at the open mouthed dog, thirsting for its lifeblood, must have called up unpleasant reminiscences, for instead of showing fight, as I should have expected it to have done, it threw out its limbs convulsively and came dashing past us at its utmost speed. It was, however, to no purpose, for the wild dog, lying flat to the ground as a greyhound, its bushy tail stretched straight behind it, covered 2 yards to its one, and came up with it in no time. It just gave it one bite in the flank, and letting go its hold instantly, fell a few yards behind. At the bite, the sable antelope swerved towards us, and upon receiving a second in exactly the same place, turned still more, so that, taking the point on which we stood for a center, both pursuer and the pursued had described about a half circle around us, always within 200 yards, since the sable antelope had first halted. As the wild dog was just going up the third time, it got our wind, and instead of again inflicting a bite, stopped dead and looked towards us. Whilst about 100 yards from it, the sable antelope also came to a stand. The baffled hound then turned round and made off one way, whilst the sable antelope, delivered from its tormentor, cantered off in another. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of the Romance of the Animal World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Thomas Hincenbergs. The Romance of the Animal World by Edmund Selous. Chapter 25. Man and Beast in the Far North. Traps that are seen through, a new discovery, cunning of Arctic foxes, the trapper and the wolverine. The various ruses mentioned in the preceding chapter were all of an offensive character, employed, that is to say, by one animal in order to entrap and prey upon another. But as much cunning may be shown by a creature in avoiding death as in inflicting it, or in securing its food. The two kinds indeed are often combined, as was seen in the last case mentioned, where but for its ingenious method of attack, the dog must soon have been impaled on the horns of the sable antelope, an animal in comparison with whose size and strength its own are quite insignificant. The same remark applies to those crowning instances of animal strategy in which the endeavor, constantly successful, is to avoid the artifices of man himself, since the successful springing of the trap is followed by a triumphant meal upon the bait with which it is set. There is nothing in its way more interesting than that keen, hard, close competition between the brain of a man and a beast that is going on day by day and year by year in the fur-bearing regions of the north, especially over the snowy wastes of the Hudson Bay territories in the far north of North America. The cunning shown by the Arctic foxes, especially in avoiding the various kinds of snares laid by the trappers for their destruction, is truly wonderful. And we should be justified in disbelieving many of the facts narrated were they not well authenticated and indeed notorious in those parts. It is, for instance, quite a common dodge for a trapper to set his spring jaw traps upside down, and the reason for his doing so is that the foxes, having discovered the principle of the mechanism, are accustomed to scratch away the earth from under the trap, and then, putting their paw up through the jaws, indeed but from the outside, so that it cannot be enclosed between them, as they fly up to press upon the pan and start the trap. When the trap is set upside down, therefore the fox is taken by surprise, and for a short time the trapper may have success. But very quickly the new experience is gained, and the traps are now started from above instead from below. Another change may be resorted to, but this is not likely to be successful unless some time has gone by, and of course the natural result of continued variation in the way of setting the traps is to make the foxes more and more observant of the way in which they lie. They become therefore more and more difficult to catch, and the trapper's best plan is to keep moving from one part of the country to another, in the hope of getting a few skins in each. The reason why the foxes learn so quickly by experience is that they are not solitary living animals, but go about either in pairs or small companies. When therefore one is caught, its mate or its fellows are witness of its misfortune, and have the dreadful incident stamped upon their memory, not only by reason of the fear which it inspires on their own account, but also through the sorrow and sympathy which the sight of a suffering and often, perhaps, a tenderly loved companion arouses in them. Another way of trapping, or trying to trap the foxes, is by setting a loaded gun with a string tied at one end to the trigger and at the other to a piece of meat. The meat lies some 30 yards from the muzzle of the gun, with which of course it is in a straight line, and the string for the whole distance is buried under the snow, the gun being also concealed, either in the same or some other way. All that appears is the piece of meat, which lies by itself on the snow as if it had nothing to do with anything. When the fox seizes it, however, he pulls the string, which in its turn pulls the trigger, and the gun going off shoots him dead. A very humane sort of trap indeed. But it is just the same as with the other kinds. After a very few foxes, or sometimes after only a single one has been shot, no more are to be got in this way. The first poor victim lies upon the blood-stained snow, but over him bends his affectionate consort, whining and wretched, yet not so given up to grief, but that the intellectual faculties are rather sharpened than obscured by the bitterness of the loss. The fatal cord attached to the meat, which in despite of tears she has perhaps managed to swallow down, lies now exposed. She follows it up, sniffing it and sometimes touching it with her paw, and soon arrives at the evil-looking object, which she knows has, for the time, exhausted its death-dealing power. A careful examination imprints it on her memory, and through life, now in particular, she carries a picture in her mind of that string attached to the trigger. It was the pull that did it. With that there came a sudden flame, and the roar of death was in her ears. 3 feet at least she leaped into the air, higher possibly, if perchance a pellet or two struck her, and then raced away over the snow that was her husband's winding sheet. She returned to find him dead, and there from his very jaws, from the protruded tongue that would never be passed over her in kindness and affection again, lay that thin dark line upon the snow that connected him visibly with death. Never in all her earthly pilgrimage hereafter will she forget that lumps of meat, though seeming to lie loose upon the ground, may yet make part of a trap, full 25 or 30 yards away, and that to touch them, whilst they do make part of it, means swift and certain death. But they may be disconnected. That thin and subtle ligament from which the whole danger proceeds is easy to sever, but how to sever it without setting in motion the thing to which it is attached? That little insignificant-looking thing, which as it is the part of the string touches, must be the key to set in motion the whole infernal machine. Smaller even than the pan of the well-known toothed strap, which by being pressed on causes the jaws to fly up, it must act upon the same diabolical principle. Something is set loose by it, something that flies out to where the meat is, and kills the fox that is eating it. Something, but what? No matter, whatever it is death. It comes and it kills, and it can only come from that long, ominous-looking tube, which is hollow at one end, and only one. Just from that end it was quite a long way in front of the trigger that the flame of fire flashed out. To be in front of that, then, and to pull the string is death, but once behind it, the string may be pulled with impunity. Still, there is the trigger. To be behind that must be safer still, and if the string can be gnawed so as not to pull the trigger at all, that will be the safest of all. As for the string, there is no danger in it. It is to start the trap merely. It is not the trap itself. That is obvious. Even a cub might see that. The whole thing lies in the trigger. If you pull that, you let off the trap. But if you can gnaw through the string without pulling it, you can take the meat without the trap going off. Or if you can let the trap off without its hurting you, you can take the meat afterwards. It may be though that not even foxes, though they are known to be cunning, could reason in this way. But if facts are to be taken as evidence, they must reason still more strongly. Not only do they draw the conclusion that to be behind the muzzle of the gun is to be in safety, but they even adopt a plan by which they are able, with almost equal safety, to go up to the meat and let the gun off by taking it in their mouth. In the latter case, of course, the string need not be cut at all, except indeed afterwards to eat the meat. But when it has to be, it is always that part of it which is near the trigger that the foxes gnaws through. This shows plainly that the danger must be connected in the animal's mind, not only with the string and trigger, but with the muzzle of the gun. But though it must therefore know that, being where it is the gun might be fired with impunity, the fox, having decided to sever the string before seizing the bait, does not do this, but leaves the trigger still on the cock. Now, as it must be easy to gnaw through the string without discharging the gun, at one part as at another, it must be as a precaution against a possible accident that the fox does so at a point where, if it did go off, it could not hurt him. Since it assures itself doubly, it cannot be said that it has not room for more than one idea in its head at the same time. But now comes the second plan, not quite so perfect as the other, as the fox may get a pellet or two in its skin, but perhaps involving even a greater degree of intelligence. Instead of going to the gun, the fox in this case digs a trench in the snow up to the meat, which it then seizes and pulls into the trench, where it lies flat. The gun goes off, but the fox is not hurt, and this is the most wonderful part of it, it has drawn the trench at right angles to the muzzle of the gun, to the line of fire, that is to say, so that the shot, instead of raking the channel, as it would if it were in a straight line with the gun and string, only strikes the edge of the cutting and goes flying over it. If men were besieging a hostile town and wished to approach it under cover of a trench, so as to avoid as much as possible the bullets from the walls, this is just how they would manage it. They would not, any more than the foxes, draw it all in one line with the line of fire, for then the bullets would fly down, instead of over it, and every man in it would be killed. The brain of the fox, therefore, as far as this particular thing is concerned, is equal to that of a man, and as the trench is always drawn in the same way, we may be sure that mere chance has nothing to do with it. The reason why the fox is able to draw the meat into the trench before the gun goes off is that the cord which connects the bait with the trigger is always a little longer than the distance between the two. For if it were not, as it is liable to shrink during the changes of the atmosphere, when the weather changes from dry to moist, the gun would sometimes go off of itself. As a rule, therefore, the meat can be moved 5 or 6 inches without anything happening, and this just allows the fox to pull it down into the ditch, where he lies with it, out of harm's way. So here are two quite different ways, each as cunning as can well be imagined, by which the fox gets the better of the trapper, and though the human element enters into such episodes as these, they still make part of the romance of animal life, seeing that the life of an animal whose skin is in demand is one long-pitched battle with man. But cunning as are these Arctic foxes, there is one animal which seems to outdo even them in its instinct, as one may almost call it, for avoiding all danger and especially snares, traps or pitfalls of any and every description. This is the celebrated glutton or wolverine, an animal which, as it is not only never to be taken itself, but enjoys nothing so much as destroying all traps that it finds set for other animals, in the very despair of the trapper. It belongs to the weasel family, but in form and general appearance is more like a bear than one of these animals, being stout in the body with long large limbs and shaggy fur, whilst it walks on the soles of its feet, which is an ursine mode of progression. Its tail, however, is a conspicuous feature, being thick and bushy, though short. In size it surpasses every other member of the family to which it belongs, so that it is able to make so large and strong an animal as the beaver its prey. It is even said that it will occasionally attack and overpower some of the larger species of deer, dropping upon them from out of the branches of trees and then tearing at their throats. Whether this is true, however, I do not know, nor for our present purposes does it much matter, for it is only from the standpoint of its cunning, or perhaps one should rather say, of its intellectual competition with man, that I am going to discuss the wolverine here. It is not that the trapper has any wish to catch him, nor for his fur, at least, which is worth little or nothing. The wolverine is not wanted, and would be let alone if he would let other people alone, but this he will not do. Nothing pleases him better than to come across a trapper engaged in his occupation, for then he knows that for some time to come he can have meat without the trouble of killing it. Where he lives, in the great pine forests of North America, the marten lives too, and the fur of the marten is very valuable indeed. The trapper goes through the woods setting a long line of traps, and when once the wolverine has come upon this line, he follows it day by day, and never leaves off doing so till he has destroyed every trap, eaten the bait, and sometimes the marten that he finds inside it. The traps are not the steel ones that are set for the foxes, nor are they the spring guns either. The marten's skin is so valuable, and at the same time so small, that the trapper does not want it to be injured anywhere. The skin of a fox that has been shot in the head or caught by one of the legs is almost as valuable as if it had not been damaged at all, but it is not the same with the marten. His skin is wanted intact, without a flaw upon any part of it. The trapper therefore makes a curious trap of branches, or poles, as he calls them, which are set in the ground, so as to make a sort of little chamber or wigwam, which has only one way into it, and across that way a noose or something is arranged, I'm not quite sure what. They never tell one in the books, so as to kill the marten, but without injuring his skin, as he gets inside. The wolverine comes to one of these little wigwams, and knows exactly what it means. There is something inside to be got, and a door to walk in by. That's something he means to have, but he is not going in by the door. He knows what would happen if he did. This is one of man's horrible treacheries, pretending to be kind and nice to animals, but meaning to destroy them all the while. It is a trap, and the way to get the better of the trap is never to do what it asks you to do, or at least not in the way that it asks you to do it. So being asked to go in by the door, the wolverine pulls out some of the poles at the other end and goes in that way, taking the bait from behind. Having done this, he generally proceeds to show his contempt of the whole thing, and especially, perhaps, of the man who thought he could take him in by destroying the trap in toto, scattering the poles all about, and then going off to do the same with the next. In this way the whole line of traps are treated one after another, and if a marten has been caught in any of them, the wolverine eats as much as he wants and hides the rest, for he is very fond of taking things away and hiding them. One may imagine the rage of the trapper when he comes back to look at his traps. Either he must get rid of the wolverine in some way, or leave that part of the country altogether. To lie in wait with a gun himself would be a tedious business, and the chances are that the wolverine would either smell him or find out his whereabouts in some other way, and so take care not to come near. He determines to trap him, or at least try to. Half a dozen traps of different sorts, acting upon different principles of destruction, he makes himself, with all the skill and ingenuity that his own cunning, sharpened by a lifelong experience, can suggest, and he sets several steel ones as well. Every 3 or 4 days he comes to look at them, but always, if the wolverine has been there at all, he finds one of two things. Either the baits have been taken and the traps pulled to pieces, or else both traps and bait have been left severely alone. In this latter case, the cunning animal has feared to touch them. There are his tracks all about, and in some places the marks of his body, where he has lain down and gazed intently at the things he was trying to understand. But he was not quite satisfied, had not entirely grasped the principle, not penetrated as deeply into the matter as under the circumstances he would like to do. Therefore he would not touch it until he saw clearly just what the idea was. The trapper must really excuse him. He would much rather leave it alone. As soon as he had discovered it, he might be relied upon. The bait was most attractive, but until then he preferred to go on with the marten traps. They were quite simple, no difficulty at all about them. For of course all the while the trapper who cannot afford to lose time and hopes every day to catch the wolverine keeps setting his marten traps as before. At last he gives up what he has been trying and determines to set a spring gun, not in such a way as he might hope that an ordinary animal would get shot by it, but more cunningly than he has ever done it before. So not only does he lay the gun amidst bushes, so that it is quite concealed by them, but blockades the way to it, as it were with a small pine tree, so that it is neither to be seen nor got at. The bait, a nice juicy piece of meat, lies temptingly just on the top of a bank that rises from a little lake where the wolverine goes sometimes, when the trapper is not there to drink. As he turns to walk up the bank, he is sure to see it, and likely this time, as the trapper would fain hope, to take it too. So he arranges everything, obliterates his footmarks by trailing a bush over them, as he goes away and comes again, a day or two afterwards. There lies the bait, just as it was, and close beside it are the tracks of the wolverine, where he has stood and looked at it. It was a sore temptation, doubtless so near his nose, but he has resisted it, and gone away to get a meal that is safe, though hard-earned. Still the memory of such a lump of meat as that will sure to linger, so next day the trapper comes again, hoping that the wolverine will have been there before him, and so he has been. But he has gone, again, with the bait, having first drawn the pine tree out of the way, and then cut the string, which if pulled would have fired off the gun, only just behind the muzzle. His tracks led down to the shores of the lake, at a part where it stretches out widely, so as to give a good view all round. There he has eaten the meat, and there the trapper finds his string, which he can use again if he likes. He does use it again 2 or 3 times, first tying it where it has been bitten through, and then arranging things in the same way. But each time it all happens over again, just as before, except that now the wolverine is careful to gnaw the string a little behind the knot, where it has each time been tied, as if it had thought that it might be as dangerous to be in front of this as in front of the muzzle of the gun. So the trapper at last, thinking that there must be a human spirit in the body of the wolverine, and a very cunning and malicious one too, gives it up, and goes into another part of the country, so far away that he is not likely to be followed. It is not only the traps that the wolverine is fatal to. If he finds the house of a backwoodsman empty, he will get into it through a hole which he makes in the wall, never through the door, even if this should be open, and then takes away whatever there may be inside. Guns, kettles, knives, axes, blankets, boxes, or cans of tinned meat. It is all the same to the wolverine. He carries them all off or pushes them along with his paws, to hide them in different places. For he is like the magpie or the bizcacha in this. Whatever he sees seems to have an attraction for him. Thus it has sometimes happened that a hunter and his family, having been so imprudent as to leave their lodge unguarded for a day or two, or perhaps having to go and there being no one to leave there, have come back and found it quite empty, only the bare walls with nothing inside them. The misfortune, however, is not so great as it seems, for the tracks of the wolverine, or sometimes the pair of them, can be followed up, and little by little everything is found hidden about in the bushes. It is not often, however, that the animal itself is discovered. Indeed, the wolverine's presence is much more often felt than seen. One ill deed after another comes to light, and is surely traced to his door, but their author remains for long periods invisible. With a cunning that seems human, he devises, plans, and executes, and with equal astuteness he chooses his time. When he does happen to meet a man, how does he act? He sits upon his haunches, like a dog begging, and holding one of his big, flat forepaws just above his eyes, so as to shade them from the light, looks long and earnestly at the intruder, for as such he considers him. This he will do sometimes 3 or 4 times before deciding that he had better go, unless indeed he sees any special reason for alarm, in which case he quickly disappears. There is no other known animal, as far as I am aware, that has this odd human-like habit. No wonder the American backwoodsman, besides looking upon the wolverine, or carcajou as he calls him, as a very malignant animal, thinks him a little uncanny as well. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the Romance of the Animal World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Hincenbergs. The Romance of the Animal World by Edmund Selous. Chapter 26. Man-eating animals, the tiger's slave, a savage lion hunt, wolf-reared children, men and apes, a sham gorilla, unprohibited murder, a monkey's malison. We have seen how some animals are, by their cunning and sagacity, able to compete even with man himself. At an earlier period, when wild animals were more numerous than they are now, and when man had nowhere risen above the savage state, this must have been still more the case. And even now, there are parts of the world where the struggle between man and beast can hardly be said to have been decided in favor of the former. Thus in India, in spite of its old and in many respects high civilization, tigers have held their own from time immemorial, and every year numbers of the natives are killed by certain individuals amongst them that have acquired a taste for human flesh in preference to any other. These man-eaters, as they are called, become wonderfully cunning and never attack either a European or a shikari or native hunter who is always armed with his matchlock. The poor laborers or cattle herds, on the other hand, who carry nothing except perhaps a stick, which of course is of no use, are totally defenseless against these lurking fiends, which hang about the villages and sometimes quite depopulate them. A fearful thing it must be, not to be able to stir beyond the little collection of mud and straw-thatched huts which make an Indian village without being liable to a sudden and horrible death. Sometimes indeed the tiger will come into the very village street and carry off a man or a woman almost from the door of their hut. Or it will lurk near the well or tank from which the water is drawn, so that to procure the precious fluid, without which the lives of the community could not be supported, individual lives must constantly be risked. The only remedy for a state of things like this is the arrival of a British officer, or at least of a native shikari upon the scene, and this in a country so large and densely populated as India, and with such a small scattering of Europeans in it, is not an everyday occurrence. Often therefore the people get tired of waiting, and after losing a certain proportion of their number, the remainder abandon the village and migrate to another part of the country altogether. No wonder all sorts of superstitions have sprung in the native mind concerning an animal so fierce and terrible, against which men, at least poor men, are so defenseless. One of these superstitions is that the tiger has power over the body of the man slain by him, for as long as he may care to come to it, that the man, under these circumstances, becomes, as it were, the slave of the tiger, and is bound to help his master and give him warning of danger should he see it approaching. Thus a story is told of a shikari who went to watch by the remains of a man that a tiger had killed, hoping to shoot the murderer when it returned at sundown to complete its repast on the body, as is the animal's habit. In the still of the afternoon, when the sun was low, the shikari saw the tiger approaching over the level ground, but while it was still at a safe distance, the corpse, all mangled and gory as it was, raised itself a little and held up a hand in warning, on which the tiger slunk away. Twice it came back, but each time it was warned in the same way by the man that was now its slave, so the shikari had to give it up and go without getting a shot. If the corpse had been left there, then even after it had become a skeleton, it would have to be obliged to help the tiger, had the latter required its assistance, but no doubt it was taken away and properly buried. The Hindus would not suffer so much from tigers if they were a more warlike race, for although they have no firearms, they might easily make spears, and a party of men with spears can kill the fiercest beast of prey. Thus the Kaffirs of South Africa, if a lion should kill even an ox belonging to them, much more one of themselves, never rest until they have taken its life in return. The whole village arm themselves with their spears, or assegais, as we call them, and follow up the track of the marauder till they have at least found him, however far he may have gone. They then form a circle round the lion, and holding an assegai in the right hand and some spare ones, together with a shield large enough to cover the whole body, in the left, they begin to close in upon him, singing and shouting. The lion, when he sees so many men advancing against him, crouches down and growling fiercely, makes ready to spring upon one of them as soon as he comes within a certain distance. He has not long to wait. The men continuing to advance make the circle ever smaller, and as he turns from side to side, doubtful on which point in it first to charge, a single warrior, as arranged probably by previous agreement, rushes forward to the combat. Instantly, the lion's attention, which has been distracted amidst the numbers of his enemies, is fixed upon this one, and with concentrated fury he comes leaping towards him. Did the man stand to receive the charge, he would be dashed to the ground by the mere weight of the lion's body, but skillful as brave, he sinks gracefully down, with his shield held over him, and stabs up with his assegai from underneath it. For one blow, which may or may not be fatal, the lion has time, but almost as he makes it, 20 or 30 assegais meet in his body, as with a tremendous yell, the rest rush down upon him, each striving to be first to shield the comrade, who has thus so splendidly performed his part. In the melee which ensues, many of the men may be more or less badly mauled, whilst some may lose their lives, but when it is all over, and it does not last many minutes, the lion lies stretched on the ground, with hardly any inch of skin in his whole body not cut by the blade of an assegai. Thus, amongst the more warlike tribes of Africa, lions have no chance of becoming habitual man-eaters, as do so many tigers in India, but in those parts of the country where the natives are timid, just the same thing happens, though even there is not often so long a lease of life for the offending animal. Most of the larger feline animals take occasionally to man-eating, as leopards in Asia or Africa and jaguars in America. The puma, however, as we have seen before, is the friend of man and never behaves in this way. Wolves, when they go in packs, are very dangerous to man, but I have not heard of their showing a special predilection for his flesh except in the province of Oudh in India, and here, since they hunt separately for the most part, and a grown person, at least a man, would be often too strong for them, it is children that they mostly attack. Night comes on, says someone who has lived there. The wolf slinks about the village site, marking the unguarded hut. It comes to one protected by a low wall or closed by an ill-fitting tatty, mat. Inside, the mother, wearied by the long day's work, is asleep with her children in her arms, unconscious of the danger at hand. The wolf makes its spring, fastens his teeth in the baby's throat, slings the little body across its back, and is off before the mother is fully aware of her loss. Pursuit is generally useless. If forced to drop its burden, the cruel creature tears it beyond power of healing, while should it elude pursuit, the morning's search results in the discovery of a few bones, the remnants of the dreadful meal. It would seem, that is to say, there is evidence which makes it difficult not to believe so for my part I do believe it, that every now and then a child that has been carried off in this way by a wolf is not eaten, but grows up with the young wolves in the den to which it has been brought, being suckled like them by the dam. The evidence of which I speak comes from various witnesses, both native and European, and whilst the different stories told confirm one another, several wolf boys, as they are called, have been actually brought up in orphanages or other charitable institutions in Oudh, into which they have been received after having, according to the account of those who brought them there, been actually captured whilst in the company of wolves, and going on all fours like them. These boys, when first caught, were just like animals in all their ways and habits, ate only raw meat, and though they got a little less wolf-like by degrees, can hardly be said to have ever become human beings, and never learned to speak. Here is an account of the capture of one of these poor wolf boys. It appeared in the Annals magazine of Natural History more than 50 years ago, and is quoted by Professor Ball in his Jungle Life in India, where a resume of the evidence on this subject may be found. It evidently seems as strong to him as it does to me, but I was wrong to say that it was difficult not to believe in the thing after reading the evidence for it, for the fact is that evidence has not so much effect on people as it ought to have. We believe a thing, or are inclined to believe it, or not, according to the general inclination of our mind, and then test the evidence by our belief, instead of our belief by the evidence. However, here is the account, and it is only one of several others. Some time ago, two of the king of Aude's sirs, riding along the banks of the Gumtree, saw three animals come down to drink. Two were evidently young wolves, but the third was as evidently some other animal. The sirs rushed in upon them and captured all three, and to their great surprise, found that one was a small, naked boy. He was on all fours, like his companions, had callosities on his knees and elbows, evidently caused by the attitude using in moving about, and bit and scratched violently in resisting the capture. The boy was brought up in Lucknow, where he lived some time and may, for aught I know, be living still. He was quite unable to articulate words, but had a dog-like intellect, quick at understanding signs and so on. Again, quoting from the same paper, there was another more wonderful, but hardly so well authenticated, story of a boy who never could get rid of a strong wolfish smell, and who was seen not long after his capture to be visited by three wolves, which came evidently with hostile intentions, but which after closely examining him, he seeming not the least alarmed, played with him, and some nights afterwards brought their relations, making the number of visitors amount to 5, the number of cubs the litter he had been taken from was composed of. I quote these accounts as the two most interesting, and for their evidential value refer against to the work I have just mentioned. Then was the famous story of Romulus and Remus true after all? Supposing the brothers had been found and rescued by peasants before they had been long with the wolf, this does not seem to me impossible, for then there would not have been the time for those dreadful, dehumanizing effects recorded in these Indian cases. But whether true or not, I have no doubt that the legend, and it is only one of many such, grew out of observed facts, and such facts were no doubt commoner in early times than they are now. As a reason for the child being sometimes suckled after having been brought by one of a pair of wolves to the common den, Professor Ball suggests that if the other of them had in the meantime brought home something else, as say a kid or a goat, and if this had been eaten first, the child lying amongst the cubs might have been received as one of them, before a fresh meal was required, in which case it would not afterwards have been hurt. He thinks it more likely, however, that the child should have been stolen by a she-wolf, to replace the loss of one or other of her cubs. I do not myself, however, think this nearly so likely. Why should it occur to a wolf or any animal to replace its own young by a human child? If it wished to adopt, it would surely adopt a wolf cub. The first of these explanations, therefore, is the one that I accept, and it seems to me a possible enough one. Children in Aude used to be so frequently carried off that there were people who made a livelihood by searching the wolf dens, on the chance of finding gold ornaments there. For in India it is customary to deck children out in jewelry, of which even the poorest people seem to have a family stock. No wonder, therefore, if sometimes one should have escaped being devoured in a way above indicated. But whether the same state of things prevails at the present time I do not know. Perhaps it does, for the people who went about looking for the jewels did not want the wolves to be exterminated, for fear they should not be able to make an honest living. Just as our own wreckers were very much opposed to the building of lighthouses, or as some ship owners think it a wicked thing that they should not be able to insure their vessels for 4 or 5 times their value. Whether they still can do this, or whether there are still professional wolf den searchers in India, I don't quite know. It seems possible, then, that man may sometimes live with animals, and lead the life that they do, in fact become an animal to all intents and purposes. On the other hand, there are animals that do not fall so very far behind man in his lowest and most savage state. I am thinking, of course, of the great man-like or anthropoid apes, in whose uncouth and satyr-like forms and grotesque physiognomies we no doubt see, if not actual copies of what our remote ancestors were, yet something very similar to what they must have been. This was Darwin's opinion, though from the stress that is always being laid upon his not having thought the existing apes our ancestors, as some still think he did, but only our co-descendants from a common progenitor, there is a danger of forgetting that it was. Man, according to Darwin's view, has very much diverged from this common ape ancestor, whilst the existing apes have not. But he has only so diverged through a number of steps or stages, and could we trace these back, we should soon reach beings, our real forefathers, differing but little from the apes of the present day. This is really not so very different from having descended from those actual apes, but many people seem to find great comfort in thinking they have not done that. It is only Tweedledum as against Tweedledee, but they make the most of it. Chief amongst these interesting beings, whose general appearance, in spite of their hairiness, their semi-quadrupedal gait, and their arboreal habits, distinguishes them amongst all other animals, as being next to kin to man, stands the great gorilla, who lives its life in the half-twilight gloom of the forests of equatorial Africa. What is this life? Unfortunately, the little we know of it is all in connection with the persecution which these creatures, like their relatives, the orangs and chimpanzees, are always liable to, and too frequently endure, at the hands of man, so that very little concerning them, beyond how they behave when shot, has yet been made known to us. The female gorilla, it would seem, makes a shelter of woven branches amongst the trees, as do both the species above mentioned, for herself and her young one. But whether the female, who is less arboreal, does this too, I am not so sure. And indeed Du Chaillu, who, though hardly ever mentioned by writers on natural history who yet follow him, knew more than anyone else about gorillas, does not, as far as I remember, give this as one of their habits. Be this as it may, the gorilla is the least arboreal of all the anthropoid apes, not climbing nearly so well or so frequently, even as the chimpanzee, its companion in the African forests, much less the orangutan of Borneo and Sumatra, or the gibbon, another Asiatic species, which is the most active of all. Its great bulk would no doubt be against this, but as the size of any animal must stand in some sort of relation to its habits of life, it seems curious that a creature living in dense forests and belonging to a climbing family should have become so large as to impede its own powers in this respect. Now the male gorilla, standing sometimes 6 feet high and being much huger and bulkier than the largest man of that height, is greatly superior in size to the female, whose stature does not often exceed 4.5 feet, for which reason she appears to be, and probably is, more fitted for nimbleness and activity amongst the branches of trees than her huge and heavy-bodied mate. But what has led to this great disparity of size between the male and female gorilla, a disparity which does not exist to anything like the same extent in the other man-like apes? Both are nourished by the same food, both must lead, or if they do not now, must at any rate once have led, the very same life. Therefore, as it would seem, there must be some special reason for their size and strength differing so greatly. It does not seem to be quite certain whether polygamy is or is not the custom amongst gorillas, but there can be little doubt that the rival males often fight together for the possession of the females. The natives showed Du Chaillu some skulls of these great apes that had the canine teeth of the upper jaw, which in the male gorilla are almost as large as lions, broken off, and this, they said, had been done in some tremendous conflict of this sort, in which their owners had been engaged. Now, if the male gorillas, beside being accustomed to fight for the females, are also polygamous, this may be a reason why they have become so much larger than the latter, for the largest and strongest amongst them would always have one, and so, by collecting together a more numerous harem, would have left a greater number of offspring to inherit their size and ferocity. The females, however, not fighting, would not have grown larger in the same way, for though in nature the qualities of one sex are often transmitted to the other, this is by no means always the case. Generally indeed, if not always, where there is polygamy, the sexes differ much both in size and appearance. What a sight amidst these gloomy forests must be the contention in fierce rivalry of two full-grown male gorillas. We may imagine one, the more favored suitor, sitting on the ground, his back, as is usual, against the trunk of a tree, and his arm flung carelessly about the object of his regard, the great fingers of the wonderfully human hand burying themselves in her fur. All at once the peaceful nature of the scene is rudely disturbed by the frowning presence of another male, whilst the silence is as suddenly broken by a terrific barking cry, passing into a long, loud, sullen, reverberating roar. The unwelcome comer has been at first upon all fours, but now he rears himself upon his short and hind legs, and leaving the screen of heavy frontage that has hitherto partly concealed him, advances into the open space beneath this tropical trysting tree. As he does so, the female discreetly retires, whilst her spouse or lover, assuming also the erect posture, comes forward to meet his rival. The two advance upon each other with ferocious mien. They roar alternately or in unison, and beat at intervals with their doubled fists upon the vast convexity of their chests, producing in this way a deep, continuous, hollow sound like the rolling of a muffled drum. As the distance between them decreases, the eyes of each seem to flash more fiercely, whilst the crest of hair upon the forehead is drawn rapidly up and down with a twitching motion by the angry contractions of the facial muscles. At length, and with a final roar, when separated by a few paces, each drops upon its knuckles and springs almost at the same time upon the other. Were it a man that either encountered, he would instantly be stretched dead or dying upon the ground. But here terrific strength upon the one side is met by force as great upon the other, and the combat is as long and as dubious as it is furious and violent. After a heavy blow or two dealt with the open palm, the aim of either champion would probably be to pull the other towards him, so as to inflict a wound with the powerful canine teeth. As a result, there would soon be a deadlock, in which the two great creatures, pressed together and grappling in a close embrace, would gnash and tear furiously at one another. As long as the limbs were not free, the fighting would be entirely with the teeth, and as these would probably be used to parry as well as to inflict wounds, they would constantly clash together, and might thus sometimes be broken off. How, or for how long, such a combat would be likely to proceed, what might be its result, whether the provoker of it, the bashful young gorillaress, would be unconcerned during its continuance or stand regarding it with an anxious eye from her retreat amidst the undergrowth of the forest, whether too, by manifesting a choice she would become an active agent in the life's happiness, or otherwise of the two grim pretendants to her favours, or go off passively, with either one or the other as mere spoils of the victor, it is not in our power to say, nor will we here further consider. Had there been as much desire to see and study the habits of the great man-ape as there has been to procure specimens of him, which add but little to our knowledge, and that in the least interesting way we might be well informed on all these points and many others. But as it is, we must wait till real naturalists, people, that is to say, who love watching animals and hate killing them, go out to these regions. They are wanted everywhere. Doubtless bad wounds are sometimes inflicted by male gorillas upon one another in these tremendous encounters, but probably they are never fatal, since the huge framework would be as potent to resist injury as the giant strength would be to inflict it, and a gorilla that had not yet arrived at maturity would never think of trying conclusions with a full-grown one. Though the above picture is merely imaginary, yet it is not perhaps altogether void of foundation. It is natural to suppose that in attacking one of his own species, the gorilla would employ the same methods of warfare as he does against his only extraneous enemy, man, and that these are such as I have described them the following account will show. We walked, says Du Chaillu, with the greatest care, making no noise at all. The countenances of men showed that they thought themselves engaged in a very serious undertaking, but we pushed on till finally we thought we saw through the thick woods the moving of the branches and small trees, which the great beast was tearing down, probably to get from them the berries and fruits he lives on. Suddenly, as we were yet creeping along in a silence which made the heavy breath seem loud and distinct, the woods were at once filled with the tremendous barking roar of the gorilla. Then the underbrush swayed rapidly just ahead, and presently before us stood an immense male gorilla. He had gone through the jungle on all fours, but when he saw our party, he erected himself and looked us boldly in the face. He stood about a dozen yards from us, and was a sight I think I shall never forget. Nearly 6 feet high, he proved 4 inches shorter, with immense body, huge chest, and great muscular arms, with fiercely glaring, large, deep grey eyes, and a hellish expression of face, which seemed to me like some nightmare vision. Thus stood before us this king of the African forest. He was not afraid of us. He stood there and beat his breast with his huge fists, till it resounded like an immense bass drum, which is their mode of offering defiance, meantime giving vent to roar after roar. His eyes began to flash fiercer fire as we stood motionless on the defensive, and the crest of short hair which stands on his forehead began to twitch rapidly up and down, while his powerful fangs were shown as he again sent forth a thunderous roar. "And now truly," exclaims the Selous, upon whom evidently no striking sight or impressive experience was thrown away, he reminded me of nothing but some hellish dream creature, a being of that hideous order, half man, half beast, which we find pictured by old artists in some representations of the infernal regions. He advanced a few steps, then stopped to utter that hideous roar again, advanced again and finally stopped, when at a distance of about 6 yards from us. At this point the poor gorilla, who, whatever his appearance may have been, could not certainly in the malignity of his intentions have surpassed the Selous himself, was shot. In another moment he would no doubt have launched himself upon his assailants, for such the party really were, and the picture would have been reversed, except that the half-man would have been guiltless of any premeditated design against the life of an unoffending fellow creature. In another encounter we find the same distribution of blame as between the whole man and the half-one, but luck here is on the side of the latter. Our little party separated, as is the custom, to stalk the wood in various directions. Gambo and I kept together. One brave fellow went off alone in the direction where he thought he could find a gorilla. The other 3 took another course. We had been about an hour separated when Gambo and I heard a gun fired but a little way from us, and presently another. We were already on our way to the spot where he hoped to see a gorilla slain, when the forest began to resound with the most terrific roars. Gambo seized my arms in great agitation, and we hurried on, both filled with a dreadful and sickening alarm. We had not gone far when our worst fears were realized. The poor brave fellow who had gone off alone was lying on the ground in a pool of his own blood, and I thought at first quite dead. His bowels were protruding through the lacerated abdomen. Beside him lay his gun. The stock was broken, and the barrel was bent and flattened. It bore plainly the marks of the gorilla's teeth. When the unlucky hunter revived a little, he told the following story. He said that he had met the gorilla suddenly and face to face, and that it had not attempted to escape. It was, he said, a huge male and seemed very savage. It was in a very gloomy part of the wood, and the darkness, I suppose, made him miss. He said he took good aim and fired when the beast was only about 8 yards off. The ball merely wounded it in the side. It at once began beating its chest, and with the greatest rage advanced upon him. To run away was impossible. He would have been caught in the jungle before he had gone a dozen steps. He stood his ground and as quickly as he could reloaded his gun. Just as he raised it to fire, the gorilla dashed it out of his hands, the gun going off in the fall. Then in an instant, and with a terrible roar, the animal gave him a tremendous blow with its immense open paw, frightfully lacerating the abdomen, and with this single blow laying bare part of the intestines. As he sank bleeding to the ground, the monster seized the gun, and the poor hunter thought he would have his brains dashed out with it. But the gorilla seems to have looked upon this also as an enemy, and in his rage almost flattened the barrel between his strong jaws. It is not quite certain from either of these accounts whether the gorilla made his final onslaught in the upright or the quadrupedal attitude. It seems more likely that the former is intended, but I cannot help thinking myself that in the quick rush at the end of the leisurely advance, the creature would adopt his usual mode of progression, which is a sort of shambling amble on all fours, but with the forepart of the body so raised above the ground, on account of the great length of the forearms, as to make it of a transitional character. If, for instance, a man's arms were so long that he could lean on them when running, and merely stooped a little in order to do so, we should hardly say that his gait was quadrupedal, and this is how the gorilla walks or runs under ordinary circumstances. Du Chaillu tells us that the male gorilla is unmolested except by man, and also that he has never known a full-grown male to retreat upon his approach, or to act otherwise than as recorded in the foregoing narratives. Now gorillas live in the loneliest and darkest portions of the dense African jungle, and to many of them man must be unknown till he seeks them out for their destruction. As a rule, when a male is discovered, it is sitting with its back against a tree, in the way I have pictured it in my imagined scene of rivalry, whilst at least one female feeds about in its near neighborhood. Perhaps there will be a young one sitting on the ground, or clinging to its mother's breast. Now, when for the first time in its experience a man intrudes upon a gorilla's domestic privacy, and it rises and advances upon him, for what does it take him? Most probably, as it appears to me, for another and a rival gorilla, thus more than returning the half-man compliment paid by Du Chaillu. There is good evidence that monkeys of all sorts see in ourselves but a larger species of monkey, and even the various expressions of the human countenance seem in some degree intelligible to them. The gorilla sees suddenly before him, in the gloom of the forest, a creature of the same general shape as him, of his own color, too, for his skin is black, and so is that of a negro, whilst in size it at least approaches him. Minor differences such as an unaccustomed slenderness of build and an inferior development of jaws and teeth are probably but imperfectly grasped. A peculiarly weak and weedy-looking gorilla that no doubt is the general effect produced, but the masculine character is stamped upon the figure, and its approach suggests rivalry. All the details of the male gorilla's behavior on the occasion of these encounters, as narrated by Du Chaillu, are explained on the above supposition. We can see now at once why he does not seek safety in flight, for such retreat would both derogate from his honor, nor does it seem to be necessary. If indeed he saw and smelt man, as any four-footed creature sees and smells him, but instead of that, it is only another gorilla that he has to do with, an inferior and less agreeable smelling one, no doubt a degenerate, but still presuming to rival him in the affections of his spouse. Upon this hint he acts, and is, in consequence, shot by the being that he takes for a very sorry specimen of his own species. Space will not allow me to supplement this slight account of the gorilla with a few remarks about those two other large apes, the orangutan and chimpanzee, which with himself make the three nearest approaches to the human species. Indeed, there are not very many remarks to be made, for our knowledge of these most interesting creatures is contained, for the most part, in certain short descriptions of the way in which they act when shot, complacent accounts innocently worded, cheerfully told of what are really little better than so many cold-blooded, hard-hearted murders. Everything, almost, that we have heard at first hand has been in connection with these barbarous proceedings, how mothers, for instance, behave when shot with their infants clinging to them, or how the infants act when they find their mothers are dead, how one Maius or Papin will weave branches together to sit upon whilst it is shot at, and another make a shift to continue alive with legs and arms broken, the spine shattered, and all sorts of other more or less important parts injured in varying degrees, bullets flattened here and there too in the neck or jaws as lesser, though still piquant additions, enjoyable side dishes to the main feast of maimings and manglings. Tenacity of life, extraordinary tenacity of life, is the scientific heading under which cases of the last kind fall, and everyone must have noticed the strange and horrid sort of pleasure with which they are always recorded by those responsible for them, how their spirits seem to rise as the list of injuries grows longer, the more the merrier, in fact, and the more harrowing, the more welcome. This is what anyone interested in the ways of wild animals has to go through, when he seeks for knowledge concerning them. Life written very small indeed, and death with contortions in great flaring capital letters. Seldom indeed do we get the light and joy of the one unclouded by the gloom of the other. As Lady Macbeth says, "Here's the smell of the blood still." It is, I own, a mystery to me how a civilized man can deliberately kill a monkey, even much less one of the higher apes. There are many, indeed, who, having shot a monkey once, have been so thoroughly upset by its reproachful and very human-like actions that they have resolved never to do so again. But as it is better to be warned through others than by one's own experience, I will conclude this small work by giving two striking cases of this kind, both of which are quoted by Professor Romanes in his interesting Animal Intelligence. "I was wont," says Captain Johnson, "to take the first of these, one of a party of Jikri in the Babur district. Our tents were pitched in a large mango garden, and our horses were picketed in the same garden, a little distance off. When we were at dinner, a sire came to us, complaining that some of the horses had broken loose, in consequence of being frightened by monkeys, i.e. Macacus rhesus, on the trees. As soon as dinner was over, I went out with my gun to drive them off, and I fired with small shot at one of them, which instantly ran down to the lowest branch of the tree, as if he were going to fly at me, stopped suddenly, and coolly put his paw to the part wounded, covered with blood, and held it out for me to see. I was so much hurt at the time, it has left an impression never to be effaced, and I have never since fired a gun at any of the tribe." The second case is to be found recorded by Sir W. Hoste in his memoirs, and is thus alluded to by Jesse in Gleanings from Natural History. One of his officers, coming home after a long day's shooting, saw a female monkey running along the rocks with her young one in her arms. He immediately fired, and the animal fell. On his coming up, she grasped her little one close to her breast, and with her other hand pointed to the wound which the ball had made, and which had entered above her breast. Dipping her finger in the blood, and then holding it up, she seemed to reproach him with being the cause of her death, and consequently that of the young one, to which she frequently pointed. "I never," says Sir William, "felt so much as when I heard the story, and I determined never to shoot one of these animals as long as I lived." Monkeys are supposed to be less intelligent than men, and yet I never heard of a soldier shot down in battle reproaching in this dumb but dreadful way the king or cabinet ministers who had sent him out to be killed. But then, when one comes to think of it, it is not quite such an easy thing for soldiers to do as it is for monkeys. Many a poor fellow perhaps may have had it in his mind and even got his finger ready, but when he looked around, just before dying, for his king or his emperor or the cabinet ministers, why, they were not there. So what would have been the use of holding it up? End of the Romance of the Animal World by Edmund Selous.